Right.
Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of Building a Better World. I'm very excited to have a very good friend, Justin Wales, who's the author of the Crypto Legal Handbook. And he's also SVP, head of legal for the Americas at crypto.com, and formerly a partner at K&L Gates. So excited to have you on, Justin.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, looking forward to diving in here and learning more about how you wrote the book, and also to learn more about your background and how you got into the industry, into crypto. I really love all of the posts that you make on LinkedIn and on social media in general. You have a really awesome interesting insights and a lot of funny stuff that you post. So enjoy your content quite a bit. So excited to have you on.
Yeah, appreciate it.
I would love to hear maybe as a starter, some of the background, like how did you get into this? What was the journey that you had to get into crypto?
A lot of it is just dumb luck and good timing, as is most things in life. I was really into the First Amendment. And when I went to law school, I wanted to represent like newspapers, and I was like what you would call like at the time like a First Amendment absolutist. So if you kind of were in that world and following along, in about 2009, 2010, you were like a real fan of like WikiLeaks, or you were like intrigued by what WikiLeaks was doing. So at the time, WikiLeaks had posted all this information about the Iraq War and what the U.S. government was doing, and in retaliation, the Obama administration had basically put pressure on payments companies, Mastercard, Visa, PayPal, these kinds of companies, to stop all donations to WikiLeaks. So in response to that, Julian Assange basically said, if you want to donate to WikiLeaks, use Bitcoin. And I thought to myself, well, what is Bitcoin? And kind of got into like a rabbit hole there, just as this idea that you can send value, transfer value without anyone being in the middle. It was the first time I ever thought about this type of thing in the past. And then, as with a lot of things, is you just kind of like gravitate towards it, slowly learn more. You meet friends who are also interested in it. And then by that point, I was at a law firm doing First Amendment work. And some of these friends that I would meet at meetups who were like crypto people needed lawyers. And I was the only lawyer they knew. And I had no experience. I didn't know what the first thing about like what a crypto company would need in terms of law. I was representing like I was doing like constitutional questions, but I understood the basics of the technology. So I would go and I would translate the crypto to the like real attorneys who had like the gray hair, and they would translate like the securities law, or the money transmitter law, or the corporate law, and I would translate it back to my friends. And then you do that over a course of enough years, you kind of just like by osmosis end up learning all of the harder areas of like financial regulation and corporate law. And then my practice sort of grew from there.
That's awesome. So
Yeah.
you kind of took the interest in the First Amendment and kind of went down the rabbit hole when you saw that, the raising of capital for using Bitcoin, and then kind of was the translator, I guess, for the gray hairs, as you said.
Yeah, and you probably knew some of the gray hairs back in the day, when I was at Carlton Fields. But
Yep.
yeah, like for the First Amendment aspects of it just is like what hooked me, and I think it was like important from like my own development, because I didn't get into the space because like the numbers were going up, and I saw this as an investment. When I found out about it, it didn't seem like an investment to me at all. It seemed like a tool, and I never really had the idea that, oh, this is going to go and 1,000x from where it was. It just seemed like, okay, it's basically a tool that someone uses to transfer money, and then that they the person who receives it will go back to fiat. Um, and that implicates all sorts of interesting areas of like expression and association that got me interested from like a constitution perspective. And then as I kind of grew, I kind of realized the financial aspects of it like more. But initially, it was all philosophical. It just seemed like a pretty cool piece of technology that you could use to get around censorship.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I think that that is definitely what draws people to the technology is that there's really this underlying foundation that just makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think like we see how complicated the world has gotten over the last, 20, 30 years, and how much of our lives and communications are all filtered through these like handful of giant companies. So, whether it's finance or whether it's, just purely expressive communications online, for the most part, it's all being filtered through a couple very large corporations. And those corporations are very much, in communication with the government. And we have lots of examples of the government telling those companies, stop these types of people from talking to each other or sending money to each other. So it's interesting to me that there's a technology that no longer requires that intermediary, and there's a lot of positive and negative, results that come from this advancement in technology.
Yeah, yeah. And in your work as you got further into the technology and you realized, these more extended kind of use cases and whether it's the currency aspect of this or, the other ways of using the technology, how did that kind of expand your interest in the industry in general? What was the progression there?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be the first to admit, for the first several years, I was like pretty much like exclusively interested in Bitcoin. And
Hmm.
I sort of took a position of, well, this is the most interesting aspect of like the industry because I think it has these like broader democratic values that are like kind of built into it. But in a lot of ways, like it was it was a way for me to shut my brain off a little and say, oh, okay, I can focus on this one thing and everything else is like another thing that I don't have to think too much about. And over time, as I started meeting folks who are building outside of the Bitcoin ecosystem, I realized that um, a lot of folks do that. They say, okay, the thing I know a lot about is great and everything else is bad, and I don't even have to think much about it. But I started meeting these folks who are like absolutely brilliant. They were building really interesting projects that I believed in, that I thought had potential, but they were not at all interested in those like initial democratic sort of censorship resistant things that I got into Bitcoin with. And I realized like, oh, there's actually something outside of Bitcoin that is really interesting. And I started diving deep, and I started doing a lot of self study and sort of experimentations. And I realized like, well, actually, the industry is like ballooning and expanding in a way that there's a lot of interesting projects going on. And my role as an advocate requires me to understand what's happening in these other areas and appreciate like what people are trying to build, and not do what I think a lot of lawyers and I think a lot of people in like crypto do, which is, okay, just turn your brain off and only focus on the thing you know. And then before you know it, you only have like a 2016 era knowledge of like what's happening in the space. So I've actually had a lot of fun like seeing how the industry is splintered in different ways. It's splintered into DAOs and all sorts of decentralized financial applications, NFTs, and now like I think it's splintering into an interesting way with AI, and it all kind of I think comes together at some point as the internet. This is all just the internet, and the internet goes in different directions, and the internet's always I think going to be connected through some sort of decentralization or some sort of digital asset. And you know we're just in that period of time where it still makes sense to call yourself a crypto lawyer or an AI lawyer or something like that. But in 10 years from now, this is just all internet stuff. No one's going to say they're a crypto lawyer 10 years from now, I don't think.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think that a lot of the technology of this is going to be abstracted away and people are
Yeah.
gonna, think of it as the internet. And I have the same view when I explain it to people when they try to get into the terminology of things, that ultimately
Yeah.
it's, decentralization or the benefit. What is the benefit of this? What's the utility of whatever that is the technology provides?
Yeah, and like right now, the method for whatever you're trying to accomplish is important, right? Okay, you're
Mhm.
using a blockchain. Okay, these are
Mhm.
large language models, whatever it is.
Mhm.
But at some point, it becomes so seamless to actually get the result of what you're trying to do that it doesn't really matter for most people the means in which you got there, right? So you don't need to know what packet switching is at this point to use the internet. But that probably meant a lot to a lot of like technology lawyers 30 years ago. But at some point, the front end becomes so easy to use that for most people, you don't have to think about the technology itself, even though you're using the technology. And I think at that point, when it becomes like um, abstracted enough, to use your phrase, you just have to find other lawyers will find other niches, and then the stuff that I'm doing is like, okay, it's probably just like financial regulations.
Yeah. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I think we're definitely approaching that. I think over the next 5 to 10 years, hopefully, people are getting, especially with the Bitcoin ETFs this year approved. I think
Yeah.
we're getting much more mass adoption or interest in the space. What do you think about that? What's going on in terms of people understanding and getting to know this industry? How is that working?
I mean, I think it's working pretty well. I think it's a lot less risky in a lot of folks' brains to be have some exposure to crypto, whether it's Bitcoin or it's something else. I don't think, there was a time 10 years ago where you would tell someone, I would beg people, just buy a couple $100 worth of Bitcoin. What are you doing? Right. And they wouldn't. They just thought it was the craziest thing. You were lighting money on fire. I think now, people are more willing to say like, okay, there might be something there. It doesn't seem like we're going to become more analog as a financial, economy. Um, and then there's, if you have like some of the largest asset managers offering Bitcoin exposure, people who wouldn't normally want to hold Bitcoin are going to take advantage of that. I just saw today that like the state of Wisconsin had put in, I think, $99 million of their like pension fund
Wow,
into Bitcoin ETF.
that's huge.
So
I didn't see
you
that.
yeah, yeah. So you keep having like little
Mhm.
little things like that,
Mhm.
and I think eventually like Bitcoin and probably like some other currencies, maybe like Ethereum, if the ETF happens, becomes a very small portion of a well diversified investment portfolio, and then you know hopefully that creates like a base layer where things become slightly less volatile over time.
Yeah, yeah. It's progressing and it's great to hear news like that. There's a small I think active community that grows in different ways that then just compounds itself. So that, that piece of news from a state doing something like that, I think has its own effect over, that specific, not audience or demographic. So that's super interesting. What do you think
Yeah.
it's happening globally? I mean, I know the US versus other parts of the world, there seems to be a different rate of adoption or understanding in the space, not only just on the legal side, but just in terms of adoption by the mainstream. What do you think? How is that playing out in your mind?
I think people undervalue how far along the US is at adopting Bitcoin and other like exposures to crypto. It's pretty easy for most people in the US to buy crypto, whether it's at like a Bitcoin ATM that's, at a lot of, corner shops, or through like a platform like crypto.com or Coinbase. it's pretty easy to get it, and it's pretty easy to then like self custody it if you want to. Um, the problem, if it is a problem in terms of like adoption rates, is there are relatively few people, unless you take like a real position of like this is a hedge on inflation, right? You have like a philosophical reason for wanting to purchase it. There are relatively few people who need Bitcoin or need crypto in the US
Hmm.
because for the most part, their Visa card works fine when they're going to the store, right? The transaction kind of friction that we're still seeing in a lot of the crypto space, like on the payment side, makes it inconvenient unless you're like super into it and you want to do it as an experiment. However, if you the US also has like a pretty stable currency, right? Like all things considered, price of gas considered, like it's pretty stable, it's pretty reliable, and we
Hmm.
should all like want the US dollar to continue to be stable and reliable. Like I'm not like a doomer who wants to see the currency crash. I very much want the US dollar to remain the world currency. But there are places where that's just not the case, right? So you see adoption rates spike to really high levels in places that have like really insecure currencies. They have regimes that have a history or a current practice of confiscating funds. They have bank failures, right? So where did you see a lot of a growing rate? You saw it in places like Venezuela and Cuba, right? You saw it in places like Ukraine right after the invasion. It's people who needed to use Bitcoin because they needed, again, like a currency that they can hold and transfer without worrying that it'd be seized or censored. So I think these are always going to be the two kind of the yin and yang of adoption. We're going to be looking at it from like a financial perspective. What does it mean for a long-term balanced portfolio? Other countries are going to be adopting it because it's a currency of last resort. And at some point, maybe it becomes more of a global tool. But that's sort of like my view of like why there's different rates. But in terms of like countries that don't need it because you can still use your traditional bank account, I think US is actually doing like really well in terms of adoption. People are pretty comfortable with it at this point, especially the younger generations.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. You kind of it's like the vitamin versus the aspirin. It's kind of it's
Yeah.
still kind of a vitamin for us, maybe an aspirin need for someone else in a different country. But at the same time, I think I think we have a system in place and ways that people can access it, which is great. Crypto.com is a really great place to access it in the US and, Coinbase, et cetera. Um, that's awesome. I'd love to, jump into your book, Crypto Legal
Yeah.
Handbook, and hear from you about what the origins of that are. I'm sure that was a lot of learnings and experience that came out from that, and would love to hear about how you started that journey.
Yeah, it's really based on like kind of how I thought about uh, learning what I needed to get to the point where I am in my career. Like I said, I didn't start off doing financial regulation. I started off doing this kind of like weird First Amendment practice, and then because my friends who were coming to me had all different types of questions. They had corporate questions, they had regulatory questions, they had securities questions, they had money transmitter questions. Um, I didn't have an expertise in any of them. So I was basically going to all of the specific experts who only knew about that one thing and sitting in. And I realized over like the course of several years, oh, in order for me to be representing folks in the industry, you kind of have to know a lot about all of these different areas. And I don't know how much you know about like the business of like large law firms, but basically law firms want you to hyper focus on as narrow of a practice area as you can, and usually it's whatever you get assigned to on your first day of work,
Hmm.
right?
Wow.
So whoever you get assigned to, whoever needs an associate when you happen to show up, for your first day, that's what you are for the rest of your career. I was a First Amendment lawyer. I really love that, but I was lucky enough to have a mentor who was like, oh no, go explore this, and gave me enough time to go and try to gather these other areas of interest. So I wrote this to try to provide lawyers coming into the space, or even entrepreneurs who are working in crypto and want a background, the basics of what they would need to know about like what I see as like the most prominent areas of law specifically impacting crypto, as well as give folks like a pretty, I think, accessible primer on what the industry started as, where it's gone, how it's developed. So it's like part history book. How did we get to where we are? And then there's like little sub histories of, okay, what is the SEC? What is the CFTC? What is the Department of Treasury? And why do we have these different agencies regulating different areas of this industry? And how did we get here? And why? How do they all interact with each other? So it's really started with that idea of, if I were going to hire someone who was going to work for me, and I wanted to train them, here's 18 lessons of what I think you need to know in order to like start working at my firm.
Awesome. Oh, wow. So it's really is something that you would use for new associates that are coming on board.
It's really for anyone. I really did write this in a way that you don't
Yeah.
have to have any legal background. You don't have to have any
Okay.
technical background. You could write. But what I used to do is people would call me or send me messages all the time. They say,
Mhm.
I'm really interested in crypto, or I'm a law student, or I'm not a lawyer, but like I want to learn more. Where do I start? And I didn't have a good place to start. And what I did is I had about 100 links that I had collected of like YouTube videos and podcasts and blogs. And I would say, yeah, here, go through this list. And here's a bunch of like people to follow on Twitter. And here's some podcasts to like start listening to. And it was unhelpful. And no one wanted to actually like, it was just a lot of work. So the book actually started as a way of like putting that list into context. And then over the course of like a year, it became like an actual book. But originally it was just an article saying, here's 100 things you should like watch to get interested in crypto or the law. And then it became more of a like a guide.
Wow. So it really I think you got a lot of experience from, probably getting these people that you sent that list to and getting feedback on what they liked or what they were looking at or what they learned
The
from.
the feedback from every single person was
Uh-huh.
I didn't really look at any of them.
Okay.
Honestly,
Yeah.
like people who would work for me, like were
Yeah.
like, I'm not, I can't go through a hundred, YouTube
Yeah.
videos and podcasts. It was just too intimidating.
Mhm.
But this is like written in an accessible way. You can kind of sit down. It's not a resource book in that you can go, okay, let me read chapter 11. It's really meant to like, you read it from the beginning through, probably get through it in like 2 days. And then if you have that, then I have about 250 footnotes, and I link all the footnotes on my website. So if you want to dive deeper into anything, then you can get to the YouTube videos and the podcasts and the articles and stuff like that. But the idea is this is accessible. You can get like a language for what we are talking about in terms of like the technology or in terms of regulation. And then hopefully at that point you are interested enough to then follow the rabbit holes down if you want to. But it's not just here's 100 podcasts, go and
Yeah.
spend a week listening to them.
That's amazing. So very comprehensive, but you can also dig deeper into everything and go, into those footnotes onto your website.
Yeah, and it's fun. Like I love like reading about history, so I thought it's maybe important for people to get like these first principles of how do we get to the point where um, financial privacy is regulated. What is the history of that? How did we get to the point? Here's a question that a lot of people ask: why do we have a CFTC and an SEC? In
Mhm.
most countries, they just have one financial regulator. Why do we have two? Well, there's actually like an interesting history about how these, uh, commodity futures and securities developed separately, and they were regulated separately, and that's why we still have these two different uh, regimes. So I thought it'd be interesting and probably worthwhile for folks, especially folks who are non-lawyers, to be
Hmm.
able to read this in order to have an understanding of like what their lawyer's advice is. Um, because honestly, I mean, I think I don't know. You might have seen this in like the folks you talk to. It's like sometimes you just kind of assume, okay, the lawyer's got this, and the entrepreneurs take very little ownership in to like what the legal strategy is, and they say, well, the lawyer's got this. But in a lot of cases, like it's a conversation between the lawyers and the folks building the company to know what are you trying to do, why are you trying to do it. There needs to be some understanding of what the law is by the folks who are not on the legal team. And I think that that's one of the other good things about this book is it makes it accessible, how our regulations are structured.
What do you think is the, that you see is some of the biggest questions that you mentioned one, right? The two main regulatory bodies here that could be involved, but as it relates to this industry, and earlier we were talking about Bitcoin adoption and how that's kind of slowly gotten more mainstream interest. Is there some legal aspect of this that people question or ask you a lot about, mainstream or legal guys, in terms of their questions?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it right now is what is a security and where is that line?
Hmm.
And this is something that's being like debated in courts and even in Congress right now. And what I try to do is give you, rather than the answer, because the answer is still being up for debate, is give you the history of how we got to this question.
Yeah.
So to me, what um, I think most people gravitate towards is we do seem to have a lot of overlapping regimes of regulation, right? So you have FinCEN and the Department of Treasury looking at terrorist finance and anti-money laundering kind of issues, and they have the BSA. You have 50 states all taking various positions, and I go through every state in the book and kind of categorize them into different groups of what their position would be. Then you have the CFTC looking at specific types of derivatives products. Then you have the SEC looking at securities, and then you have these proposals in Congress, including one that just got proposed this week, trying to say what regulator should take on even more authority. So the question a lot of people have is, well, crypto's not regulated, but in fact, it's regulated in overlapping, sometimes confusing ways. So just getting that straight of who's actually your regulator, what is the purpose of that agency's mandate, that ends up like solving a lot of folks' confusion because it just requires someone to walk them through in
Hmm.
a way that I think is accessible and not kind of walled off intellectually.
Yeah. And so, as people come to those understandings, and whether it's entrepreneurs or um, people in the industry, as they're thinking through these problems, do you think, are there, potential, I think the thing that's exciting about this technology is that it allows us to maybe do things that historically couldn't be done, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
mentioned at the beginning the power of being able to transmit uh, currency or money to people, to each other. Is there something that, as we think about law or even other parts of the technology, AI, uh, is there things that kind of fundamentally you see as an interplay that people aren't thinking about that could be possible with this technology?
Yeah, so many. I mean, the way that we talk about crypto and the way we talk about just technology right
Hmm.
now is so myopically focused on investments,
Hmm.
right? As if it's like the numbers will either go up or down, but they really have nothing to do with the networks that are represented by the tokens, right?
Yeah.
And one of the points that I tried to make in this book is that I think lawyers who are in the space should understand where the technology is now and where it's going, and this
Hmm.
idea that like we could actually have exponential growth and exponential adoption,
Hmm.
and then also they should be able to articulate not what the technology can do now, but what it can do in the future. And this
Hmm.
is incredibly important because as we're talking about regulating crypto, right? If we take too narrow of a view, all of a sudden, if you want to go and do something on a decentralized network, and the only way you have access to that decentralized network is by getting a token that grants you access to it.
Hmm.
If you're regulating that as if it's this walled off financial product that has no value other than what it'll go up or down by a market price, then all of a sudden you're making it really hard to obtain like a network effect. So being able to explain that and to, I think to have like a passion for where we could be going is incredibly important. The other aspect of it, and a couple of years, maybe 5 years ago, I wrote an article called Bitcoin is Speech. And it kind of
Hmm.
takes a First Amendment view on Bitcoin and other decentralized networks and says, okay, the capital B Bitcoin network can only function as a result of transmissions of the lowercase b Bitcoin currency.
Hmm.
So if I can engage in all sorts of non-financial transactions with Bitcoin, then you can't necessarily treat Bitcoin as a completely financial tool. You have to embed it with the same sorts of rights that other types of networks that have no financial market have. So again, this has been like this was a very controversial sort of view at the time, and even in some circles, it's still incredibly controversial. That what are you saying? Bitcoin's not a financial tool, and I'm saying, well, no, it is, but it's also something else. And there's a lot of technologies that we're encountering in at like a very, very early stage that can
Hmm.
turn into something else. And the point of regulation should be we got to protect people, but we have to protect people in a way that allows these technologies and allows this innovation to move the same way that we did the internet. And this is the thing that like boggles my mind is
Hmm.
we have an amazing example over the last 20 or 30 years of the government saying we're going to take a hands-off approach. We're not going to punish people for just building internet tools,
Hmm.
and we'll see where it goes. And the result of it is that you're in Spain and I'm in California, and we're having a conversation on the internet in real time. This is like an amazing thing that we've just done as a society, and we haven't seemed to be learning these lessons.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot to the network that's being created than just the financial currency aspect of it. And the network itself is connects so many other aspects of our lives. I mean, as we think about, this at Superworld and connecting, the virtual and the physical, um, how, I guess that kind of makes me think, what are all of the different aspects of law that, the physical world and currencies and networks and AI and I think at the beginning, I think even prior to the call, we were talking about all this is going to be the internet, right?
Yeah.
This is the internet. So yeah, I think it's we got to open up the lens of how we think of this topic, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, do you remember when like you first started using the internet and you would
Mhm.
say that like, oh, I'll be right back. I'm
Yeah, I'm going offline.
um you'll see the areas of law that impact, technologies just start to impact everything else. Like I know lots of divorce lawyers who have had to learn a lot about technology because all of a sudden assets and custody become important to them, right? So that in the same way, like every lawyer is an internet lawyer in some regard, because the internet impacts every type of practice, whether it's because the subject matter is technology based or because you're using the internet for different litigation tools or capital table management tools or something like that. I think it's the same thing that's happening with crypto and technology in general.
Yeah, that's a good point. Just to kind of switch topics a bit, you're a very busy guy, working on a lot of different projects, in the space. What are some of the things that you do to kind of stay up to date on the industry? You're very active on socials, and this industry moves so fast,
Yeah.
in general. Can you give, our audience kind of a way, and you do have a lot of footnotes on the website, and I think everyone's going to go buy your book, which I highly recommend. What is a way of staying current in your mind?
Yeah, I mean the last chapter of the book is basically a roadmap for staying up to speed, right?
Okay.
So so for like the legal, a lot of the legal stuff, I'll be updating the book and kind of updating the website, and I have like a newsletter. But for the most part, there's probably, I don't know, 200 Twitter accounts that are like serious and kind of give you fairly good information. So I have like a list in the book, and you can even find that on the website for free if you want. And then there's like a handful of podcasts and sort of like news sources. But I find a lot of it is just like you can't stay current until you already are passionate about it. And
Yeah.
and and I believe that's the case. So like the best way to stay current, I think, is that you start learning about everything that's happened in the past, and you see if like, do you care about this? Like I know people who want to be in crypto, or they are in crypto, and they don't care about crypto at all. They don't really get it. They think it's okay, maybe it's a good career path, but I'm not interested in it. And those are always the people who, if I'm talking to, I'm like, oh, did you hear about this? And they have never heard about it, right? So I do think like passion is the way, like developing a passion, developing like an expertise is the way you end up staying current, because naturally you're going to want to be listening to like the podcast. You're going to be wanting to get the newsletters and to read up about it. So there's a bunch of like practical places you can go once you get to that point. But by the time you want to get there, you will already know all the resources for the most part.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. So that's great. And it's great that you're also updating the resource, because I think people are going to be really keen to get the updates, because this industry moves so fast. So it's an
Yeah, and
organic living book.
well, and this is where I feel like I've like cracked the code a little bit, because one of the reasons I wrote this is I would get told by these like law students or college students that they had to go and buy like their professor's books, and the books were like 3 or 4 years old. They were like 400 pages long. They sometimes cost like $200 or $300, and I was like, oh well, they're out of date and they're so expensive and they're not like fun to read at all. So the idea is I self-publish this. I'm able to update a manuscript um, with basically 72 hours notice.
Mhm.
So if the Coinbase case is decided today and you buy this book on Friday, right? Tonight I'll update the manuscript. On Friday, if you buy it, you'll get the updated manuscript.
Wow.
So the idea is, for at least for this, is every right ahead of every fall and spring semester,
Hmm.
usually before like this gets on the syllabuses, I'm just going to update it. So
Hmm.
whoever is picking it up is going to have like a current up to date roadmap up until that point. And then at that point, hopefully after they read the book, they will have like the tools needed to like keep ahead if they want. It also allowed me to keep costs. Like I think like most textbooks are, $200-300. This is $30.
Incredible. That's
Yeah.
awesome. And I love that it'll be ready for every semester. So as legal students are joining, they're getting all of the latest case law, right?
It's the case law, but it's
Yeah.
also, if Ethereum forks, if there's
Hmm.
like a new DeFi protocol that
Hmm.
just you couldn't possibly be in this industry without having known about, I can add it to it. I can have a section there. I can give you resources on how to learn more, and
Hmm.
kind of take you through that process. So it's my best effort to try to keep up with a topic that moves really quickly, and I don't know, depending on on how well like people continue to buy it, we'll see how long the updates last.
Awesome. Well, you know, it's been really amazing having you on today, and I'm glad we've got a chance to catch up. Is there anything else that you want to talk about? You know, to kind of close off, any things you want our audience to know about what's coming or things that you're doing, where people can find you? There's a lot going on in the industry as we ramp up now. So,
Yeah, I mean, you could reach out to me on like LinkedIn or Twitter. I guess maybe you can put like some links in the
yep,
show notes or
yep,
under the video. Um, but yeah, I think like my overall message is we're a part of an industry that's trying to do something that's really big and really amazing, and we should try to remain optimistic about this. And even though there's like a day, day to day, you might get some bad news from like a court case, or you might get some bad news, in terms of like how the administration is treating the industry. I think overall the trajectory looks really optimistic, and it's a really fun industry to be in, despite all of the sort of volatility.
yeah. Long term, I think it, fundamentally just makes a lot of sense. And I think over time, regardless of what jurisdiction you are in the world, I think that there's going to be much more of a framework here for this type of technology. It just only makes sense. So, um,
Yeah, everything that we're dealing with now
mhm.
that is, the news of the day, these are very, very short-term
Yeah.
issues that are going to be completely forgotten in, 10 years. And I think, again, over the course of like the long history of the internet, I don't see us getting less digital. So, uh, being involved in like digital assets is probably a good thing in the long term.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Justin. It's been a pleasure and an honor, and always fun catching up with you. So really appreciate you being on our podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
See you, man.